Well, it's time for this year's deeper dive into Acts 1, 18 through 20. I've already talked a little bit about 18 and 19 when I did the head off video for the week. The interesting thing here is the tension between Matthew 27, I think it is, and Acts 1 here. Here in Acts 1, Judas takes the money and buys a field, and then dies by falling headlong and his bowels bursting open. In Matthew, of course, Judas returns the money, throws the change, 30 pieces of silver at them, and they buy the field, and he dies by hanging himself. Now, maybe these can be fit together. I suggested that I'm not sure that we should try to fit them together at the beginning of the week. Today, I want to talk a little bit about the way the New Testament uses the Old Testament. So we have two quotes here. We have Psalm 69 and Psalm 109. Now, I want to present to you my hermeneutic and theology of the New Testament use of the Old. This is a very controversial area. I don't think, though, myself, that the theology that I'm about to present to you, I don't think is actually very ambiguous if you do the detailed examination. However, it does go against the grain of a lot of thinking, and even in some circles, like Al Mohler, who is president of Louisville Southern Baptist. He's a smart guy. I can't understand how he has the position he does, which is basically that the New Testament reads the Old Testament for what the Old Testament actually meant. Again, I just don't see how any sustained examination, verse by verse, passage by passage, can come up with that conclusion. Not if you know how to read in context. So here's my theology. My theology is that there are two moments of inspiration. There was the moment of first inspiration when the text was written, and then there's the moment of second inspiration when the New Testament author read that passage. Now, the relationship between these two moments of inspiration, I think, varies. Sometimes a New Testament author does read an Old Testament passage somewhat in context, but at other times, I don't think they do. My theology of Revelation is that God meets us where we are. Obviously, if God meets me where you are, that's not very helpful to me. And if God meets me where ancient Israelites were, that doesn't necessarily help me that much either. Or if God meets ancient Israelites where I'm at, that certainly doesn't help them any. And so it seems to me that God is incarnational in his revelation. He meets people where they are. Where am I? Well, I have assumptions. I have a worldview. I have paradigms. I have ways of looking at the world. And so God meets me within my paradigms. Now, it's not that you can't enter into somebody else's paradigm. I mean, the whole purpose of education of the sort that I'm part of is getting into the heads of the ancient Israelites, or getting into the heads of the ancient disciples. This video is about trying to get into the head of Luke or the Psalm. So I don't think that this is a matter for despair. I'm just saying that it makes sense that God would start by meeting us where we were. And so part of that means meeting Luke within Luke's assumptions. And Luke had certain assumptions about the Psalms. So, for example, one of Luke's assumptions about the Psalms was that David wrote most of the Psalms. Now, when I remember growing up, you know, if a pastor had been to seminary, a lot of time he would talk about the psalmist instead of saying David. And there's a reason for that, and we'll talk a little bit about some of that. I have no problem with the idea that David wrote some of the Psalms. I believe that David wrote some of the Psalms. But, of course, the headings, Psalm of David, so Psalm 69 says Psalm of David. Psalm 109 says Psalm of David. And so, you know, it's the natural thing to think is, well, of course, David wrote it. And at the time of Christ, everybody thought that David wrote these Psalms. So it makes sense to me that when God met the authors of the New Testament where they were, that he would have met them with the assumption that David wrote the Psalms. To me, that wasn't the point. That was the envelope in which the point came. That was the clothing in which the point came. And there's a reason for thinking that I'll talk about in a second. But there was a moment of first inspiration. And that first inspiration was to the psalmist, and whoever that is in each case. I mean, it's clear from even the headings that the Psalms weren't all written by the same person. There's Psalms of Asaph, there's Psalms of Solomon in there, a Psalm of Moses in there, and of course Psalms of David. So even the Psalms themselves don't in their current form, don't say that they were all written by the same person, who was David. And so there was a moment of first inspiration where God met the psalmist where they were. Now, what does inspiration mean with regard to the original psalm? That's a very interesting question, because the primary purpose of a psalm is not to inform you of things. The primary purpose of a psalm, it seems to me, is emotive. It's affective. So there are psalms of thanksgiving. What is the function of a psalm of thanksgiving? Why, for the psalmist, it was to give thanks. And then later in Israel, it was for Israel to give thanks. And I would say that it makes sense for us to use the Psalms to give thanks. So what does it mean to inspire a psalm of thanksgiving? Well, of course, for me, inspiration is cooperative. I don't subscribe to a dictation theory of inspiration. Why? Because all the books have different styles. The books have, if God dictated all 66 books, wouldn't we expect them to have a single style and a single paradigm and a certain single worldview? We wouldn't expect to find the cultural, the variations in style, the variations in vocabulary. We wouldn't expect to find the personality. We wouldn't expect, would God dictate to Paul to say, I wish those who are troubling you would emasculate themselves? Is that feels more like an emotional thing on Paul's part. This is a hermeneutical question. What does it mean to say that the more emotive and affective aspects of Scripture are inspired? What does that mean? Well, I think probably it can mean multiple things. One of the things that it means is that these psalms are appropriate vehicles and catalysts for catharsis, for emotional catharsis, for emotional expression. Psalms of thanksgiving help people think. Psalms of praise help people praise. Psalms of lament help people get it all out. And psalms of imprecatory psalms help people get their anger out. So you could see that inspiration with regard to psalm is a little different from the inspiration of something that's telling you propositions, for example. So there was the first inspiration of psalm. Then there's the inspiration of Acts. Luke, the author of Acts, whoever that might be, we'll say Luke. The inspiration of Luke to read the psalm in a way that will help Theophilus and the church in Luke's day. And to do that, God meets Luke within his assumptions. Luke assumes that David wrote these psalms, and so God meets him there. I don't think that's the point of the inspiration. So this is kind of what we're talking about. And God makes two verses. So God makes two verses pop out at Luke. Now, maybe Luke inherited this. I'm not saying that Luke was the first one to see that these verses might be connected to the psalmist. Now, you might say, well, Peter did. Okay. It just gets so complicated when you begin to go into you take the deep dive into scholarship. Well, let me. That's all prefatory. Let's go back. So the first quote is, "It is written in the book of Psalms, let his homestead become desolate, and let there be no one to live in it." So what is the inspired point that Luke, or Peter's Luke, or Peter, what is the inspired point? The inspired point is that I would say God zapped Peter or God zapped Luke while reading this verse to see, okay, it's appropriate that Judas's spot in the disciples would be abandoned. Well, let's go back to Psalm 69 and look at that verse. So I think that's verse, is it 25? May their camp be a desolation, let no one live in their tents. Okay, Psalm 69, what is this psalm? Save me, O God, the waters have come up to my neck. I sink in deep mire, there's no foothold. Come to deep waters. The flood sweeps over me. I'm weary with my crying. My throat is parched. My eyes grow dim with waiting for my God. Okay, so this is a psalm of crying out. So what was the original meaning of this psalm? I waffled a little in the video about whether this was a psalm of lament or an imprecatory psalm. Obviously, there is some crying out here, but I suspect it is a, let's look at the end here. He's praying, okay, let their table be a trap for them, a snare for their allies. So this seems to imply that it is an imprecatory psalm, at least to some extent, because he's calling for God to bring justice upon the psalmist's enemies. They gave me poison for food, and for my thirst they gave me vinegar to drink. Okay, this sounds like Jesus. You see the multiple layers here. The psalm originally was probably not, let me put it this way, the Israelites did not understand the psalm to be about the Messiah originally. I don't think there's any evidence from this psalm, if you read it, that this psalm was originally about the Messiah. In fact, let me go to the end here. God will save Zion and rebuild the cities of Judah. Were the cities of Judah destroyed in the time of David? No, they weren't. And so this line right here suggests that this psalm was not actually written by David. It suggests actually that this psalm comes from a time after the exile. You can see where this idea, this is not, oh, they're liberal. This is inductive evidence that suggests that this psalm would not have been written by David. Now, there's also the mention here, zeal for your house has consumed me. So was there when was there a house? This is another question. When was there a house? David had not yet built the temple in the time of David, although Chronicles talks about David wanting to build the temple. But what house is being talked about here? It seems to me that the most logical house would be the temple. And of course, that's the way you're hearing places where this psalm was taken messianically by the earliest Christians. You see how it's man, this is crazy. So let me kind of cut through to the chase. There was an original meaning for this psalm. My hunch is, and I'm not an expert on the psalm, but just doing inductively, knowing that this title was not added until years after the psalm, probably. This seems to be a psalm written in the late 500s BC, when there was either a desire to rebuild the temple, and of course the temple was rebuilt in 516 BC. These are the days of Haggai. These are the days of Zechariah, who are saying, we need to rebuild this temple. I can hear Haggai saying this. I can hear Zechariah saying this. Zeal for your house has consumed me. We need to get this temple built. And of course, Judea was not completely rebuilt until the 400s in the days of Nehemiah. The wall was rebuilt in Nehemiah. God will save Zion and rebuild the cities of Judah. Now, I'm not an expert on this psalm, but what I'm saying is there was probably an original meaning of this psalm that fit into the late 500s BC. Save me. More in number than my head are those who are with, Lord, don't let those who hope in you not be put to shame because of me. Could this be Zerubbabel or Haggai or Joshua? Remember Joshua? Zeal for your house has consumed me. I humbled myself. When I made sackcloth my clothing, I'm the subject of gossip for those who sit in the gate. The drunkards are making song about me. My prayer is to you. Rescue me. Deliver me. Answer me for your steadfast love. You know the insults I receive. Insults have broken my heart. I look for pity. Let their table be a trap for them, a snare. Let their eyes be darkened so they cannot see. Pour out your indignation on them. Let your burning, may their camp be a desolation. Oh, there's the verse. Now, clearly this is not a prophecy about Judas in its original meaning. Again, I believe that God zaps people. I believe God zaps me. I believe God zaps you, where you're reading a scripture and God makes it come alive. He quickens it, and it jumps out at you, and you hear a word from the Lord. I believe in that. And so I believe that's what happened to someone in the early church, maybe Peter, maybe Acts, maybe someone in between Peter and Acts, which leads us to applying this verse to Judas. Now, you notice that this psalm was read of Jesus in a number of places. And again, they didn't read the whole psalm about Jesus, but there are certain verses in this psalm that jumped out at some early Christian, maybe Peter, about Jesus. And they heard Jesus's voice. This is a second meaning. This is a spiritual meaning. This is a fuller sense, a sensus plenior, where this was now read. This was now read on the lips of Jesus. Now, in this new Christian reading, it's Jesus speaking. Save me. The waters are up to my neck. I sink. There's no foothold. I'm weary. More are those against me than are with me. Again, notice here, though. Oh God, you know my folly. The wrongs I have done are not hidden from you. Jesus can't say that. Jesus didn't do any wrongs. I mean, again, what is Al Mohler thinking? Verse 5 here makes it clear that the original meaning of this psalm could not in any way have been of Jesus, because the psalmist is confessing his wrongs. So again, this is not a problem. This is not a problem, but it does suggest that the way the American church thinks about these things is thoroughly superficial. And it's setting up for the brighter minds to have a faith crisis. Okay, well, I've talked enough. I would say when we get to Psalm 109, it's not quite as stark as Psalm 69 is. But when we get down to verse 25, is it? No, it's verse 8 that it quotes. May his days be few. May another seize his position. Now, here's the thing. This is actually right. Well, okay. So we have a righteous person at the beginning. Do not be silent, O God. The wicked, again, an imprecatory psalm. Wicked or deceitful mouths are opened against me, speaking they beset me with words of hate. They say, appoint a wicked man against him. Let an accuser stand on him. When he's tried, let him be found guilty. Oh, okay. Yeah, here's what I was going to say. This is talking about the righteous person. So the righteous person starts talking. And the righteous person's opponents are saying, appoint a wicked man against this righteous person. Let an accuser stand against this righteous person. When he is found, let him be found guilty. Let his prayer be counted as sin. May his days be few. This is what the enemies are saying against the righteous person of the psalmist. And so it's the righteous person that the enemies are saying, let his days be few. And so again, this is not a problem. This is not a problem. I have come to the conclusion after looking at over and over and over again, it is not a problem for the New Testament authors to be Pentecostals and holiness people. God zapped them. They were reading the Old Testament and God zapped them with meanings. But there was a first inspiration. And the first inspiration is the inductive meaning. When we use inductive Bible study on the Psalms, we come up with an inductive meaning. And it isn't always the same as the Pentecostal holiness zapping that the New Testament authors had, but that's okay. Okay, well, this won't be the end of this. Let's keep going.